I've never particularly cared for mountains all that much. Much like Charlie Sheen, they're large, white, high, and no one particularly cares about them unless some serious goes down. John Krakauer focuses on these attributes throughout the entire length of his adventure novel, Into the Air. Make that Into Thin Air. After the excruciating experience of reading John Krakauer's Into the Wild in English class, a novel with about as much personality as a brick and about as much flow and momentum as a narcoleptic giving a PowerPoint presentation, I naturally greeted the news that this book was our required summer reading assignment with a deep sigh of this book will suck hard enough to turn me into a ring pop. This was especially disappointing because the book we were assigned last summer, Hate List, was actually very good. At least that time remembering it, as I haven't read it since then, and when I did it was before I had discovered the magnificent world of guilty pleasures like the books of John Green and taking Excedrin with Dr. Pepper, so my memory could be hardly skewed. Either way, I just know that going from reading a book like Hate List to a book like Into Thin Air, in terms of enjoyment factor at least, was probably going to be something like going from eating a symphony bar to licking chocolate Cheerios off the floor of a pool's bathroom. Naturally, with this in mind, along with various other pop culture influences, I went into Thin Air with high hopes of being able to hate it. Did I? Well, surprisingly, it ended up being much like the case of Hate List, in which my expectations were surprisingly yet pleasantly exceeded. However, I should clarify that my expectations for Hate List were that it was actually going to be a very good book, therefore exceeding those expectations was a lot harder, and the book ended up being relatively fantastic. And my expectations for Into Thin Air were that it was going to be a pile of ass, therefore it wasn't as hard to exceed those kind of expectations, and the book merely ended up being passable. But I suppose in the end, you could say that I actually kind of liked it. However, that does not mean that the book is actually good. Something can still be terrible, and I won't be able to stop myself from liking it. What I mean by that is, the book still has its flaws, but they were mainly just afterthoughts that I didn't really care about while I was reading the book. However, if I said these flaws weren't there, you would discover it to be an obvious lie when reading the book yourself. That doesn't make any sense. If I said these flaws weren't there, the book would have been a much better and more emotional experience. For instance, all the characters in the book have about as much personality as a bunch of bricks tied together. At least that's how John Krakauer makes them out to be. The only real character who's actually flushed out thoroughly enough is John Krakauer himself, and his personality is just stone cold and uninteresting as it is. This problem got so bad that I eventually just stopped trying to put effort into remembering how to correctly match up the bland names with Krakauer's extremely vague and generalized descriptions. This eventually turned out to be a problem when almost all the characters started to die, so eventually it just became like eating a box of Raisinets and leaving a random amount of uninteresting ones at the bottom of the box so that they could all congratulate each other on how lucky bastards they each were. I suppose this leads me into my main problem of the book, which was that I simply really didn't care at all whether anyone died. And I know it's a work of non-fiction, so Krakauer wasn't able to go that extra mile to make it theatrical, but that's not what I'm talking about. If there had just been some characterization, I would have actually been able to feel a bit sad when someone died, because I would have had time to care about them or their families or their relationships with the others on the expedition. But no, instead we get these vague character descriptions that sound like Krakauer just wrote down the person's name, cracked open a fortune cookie, and then typed in whatever it said afterwards. Now, one could argue that Krakauer intended it to be this way, along with some overly pretentious reason like it's supposed to be about one man's journey into the pinnacle of the environment in which he discovers how vital to his soul it is, which seems now to be what he makes every one of his books about, but come on, that's as much of a cop-out defense as just running away. That's like when I try to say that's how Nolan intended it when someone actually points out the fact that all the supporting characters in Inception were hollow and motivationless avocado skins. Sure, maybe that was the intended effect, but the simple fact of the matter is that it would have been better if it weren't that way. As far as the actual reason for reading this book is concerned, I'm not entirely sure. At least Hate List is actually relevant and taught us that in order to have a fulfilling bullet-free high school experience, the entire student body just needs to hold each other's hands and prance around the hillside of Marigold hugging kittens. I can't imagine what the message behind Into Thin Air will eventually be. Maybe something along the lines of we all need to be each other's spare oxygen tanks and inject our life-giving selves into each other's respiratory systems even when the douchebag expedition leader keeps telling everyone that they're all empty. In the end, if forced summer reading books were fast food restaurants, then Into Thin Air would be like going to McDonald's and being told you're only allowed to get fries. You can't help but let out a long sigh because there was so much potential for adequacy there, but considering the fact that you weren't expecting much in the first place, one could consider it to be a relative treat. Besides, it's not nearly as bad as the other books we had to read, which were about as enjoyable an experience as pulling barbed wire through one of your ears and out the other, then flossing yourself into a coma.